Cornerback. I think we all know that that is absolutely a position of need for LSU, both in the short term and long term, for the bowl game and for the 2023 season and beyond. So, what's the plan, not just for cornerback in the bowl game, and not even just cornerback moving forward and recruiting that position, but what's the plan for recruiting all positions moving forward? Brian Kelly spoke with the media on Saturday, so we'll break down all that he had to say and their vision for the future on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first to listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Plus, we're on YouTube as well. So check us out on YouTube also. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I'm your host, as I am every day. Of course, we're part of the Locked on Network, your team every day. I graduated from LSU. I've been covering LSU football since 2016, and I am now a sports talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee. So before we take a look at the future, I want to take a look at, the more near future. Before we do that, I want to tell you guys that LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So the cornerback position has been a position of need and has been almost like an insecure position, at least for me. Like, I look at that position and I have all year long. As soon as Brian Kelly was announced head coach, this time last year, going into this season, I was worried about the cornerback position. I was worried about the depth. I was worried about the experience. I was worried about how they were bringing in so many different pieces from different programs across college football. And I was thinking to myself, how in the world is this going to work? Now, the DBs this past year, I think, absolutely exceeded my expectations and exceeded the expectations of probably you too. Like, I didn't really expect much from the DBs. I thought it was going to be a defense that was carried heavily by the defensive front, which still is true. That's no knock on the defensive line, and that's no knock on the DBs. I mean, it's just an elite defensive line, an elite pass rush. But the DBs wound up being, a really solid unit. But that insecurity that I felt about that position group never really wavered because I understood how much of a position group of need that was going to be for LSU moving forward. That they kind of were able to address it in the short term, get a bunch of pieces through the transfer portal that had college experience. You look at Seven Banks, you look at Jarrick Bernard-Converse, you look at Greg Brooks, you look at Joe Foucha, all pieces that were picked up from programs across college football that had college football experience. But the one bad thing about getting guys with college football experience is that they don't have a ton of eligibility left. And for the case of a lot of those guys, Seven Banks excluded, they've exhausted their eligibility. So they will no longer be a part of LSU's team moving forward. So what's the plan? There's a plan moving forward. There's a plan in 2023, and there's also a plan for the bowl game. So let's look at, first and foremost, the short-term goal. What is the plan for the bowl game? Brian Kelly spoke with the media on Saturday, gave a little bit of an update about the status of players, the bowl game plan, and also the plan for recruiting moving forward. But this was Brian Kelly on the cornerback position for the bowl game.
So we've got Jarrick Bernard-Converse. So obviously he'll be available, and Jay Ward. So feel really good at the cornerback position. Those will be our starters. I think we feel like the depth there is certainly young, but we'll be okay there. So we feel like our two starting corners are going to match up very well.
Okay, so there you go. Expect Jarrick Bernard-Converse and Jay Ward to be your two starting corners per Brian Kelly. Of course, we know that Jay Ward has declared for the NFL draft. Good for him. But he also announced whenever he decided he was going to go to the NFL draft, whenever he made that announcement, that he would still play in the Citrus Bowl, which I appreciate. I love that. I'm never going to, look down on a player if they choose not to participate in a bowl game, but shout out to Jay Ward for coming back for that final game with LSU and hopefully going out on a good note. So Jarrick Bernard-Converse, Jay Ward, Brian Kelly also mentioned in his press conference that we could expect some young guys to come out and fill those spots. LaTerrence Welch was one of those names that he did mention, that LaTerrence Welch redshirted this past year, and he will not use up that red shirt availability because of the new rule that players can now play in a bowl game without worrying about compromising their red shirt status. So LaTerrence Welch did redshirt this past year. We can probably expect to see him in the bowl game as well. And that new rule change is huge. Whenever you're dealing with guys that are opting out, whenever you're dealing with depth issues, and you don't want to compromise redshirt status just for a bowl game, I think that rule change is huge. But Brian Kelly mentioned that LaTerrence Welch and some of these younger guys that we didn't see a ton of this year, that didn't get a ton of looks, were able to scrimmage over the past couple of days. They scrimmaged on Saturday. They were able to get some good looks and able to compete for some playing time in the bowl game. So expect to see LaTerrence Welch and some of these other younger DBs that we haven't seen a ton from this past year. Each, maybe because of a redshirt status, maybe because just of depth concerns. That's what we can expect. Jarrick Bernard-Converse, Jay Ward, the two names that we do know, the two proven commodities that we have seen throughout this season, expect them to be out against Purdue in the bowl game. Now, how do those two DBs and how does the rest of this DB class match up against the Purdue pass game? That'll come later this week. We'll do a full breakdown of the bowl game once that gets a little bit closer. But what's the philosophy for not just the cornerback position in the bowl game? Because Brian Kelly said, we feel good about some of these guys. We're going to get some youth out there. They'll get some experience. The bowl game is one thing. I think the bigger thing for me is, however excited I am about the Citrus Bowl, the biggest thing for me is, what's the plan moving forward? Who can we expect to see play that cornerback position in 2023? And I'll even go as far as to say, what's the recruiting philosophy in 2023 and moving forward? Brian Kelly gave us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, and I want to break down what he had to say coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about LinkedIn Jobs. So these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business, and you want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. I mean, you're a small business owner. You don't want to waste any time. You don't want to waste any money, so that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. That's a tool that the radio station that I work for currently, that's what we used. It was a free tool, which was way better than going out to any other recruiting agencies that require really high paying, upfront salaries or upfront costs. Don't do that. Just go to LinkedIn Jobs. So all you have to do is go to LinkedIn Jobs or go to LinkedIn.com. It's super easy. Add your job on LinkedIn and then add the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are hiring. You've got super simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you would like to hire. Don't worry about screening all the people who don't have the right experience or expertise for your job, because LinkedIn will take care of all the hard work for you. And we're almost to the end of the year. It is so important to finish the year strong and start 2023 off right. So finding the right team member can help you do that. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. So make sure to check out Locked On Sports today. It's the biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less, which is great. Plus instant reactions. They've got game recaps, Locked On's take of the day, Locked On Sports today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. So cornerback, I know, is a position that we all have been looking at of LSU needs some depth. LSU needs to get some guys in here because where it stands, there's only 2 scholarship corners coming in 2023. Seven Banks, who transferred from Ohio State this past year, but was on and off the field a lot this year because of injury. And then another name that I mentioned in the last segment, LaTerrence Welch, who redshirted this past year. So not a lot of experience and not a lot of depth, not a lot of bodies at the cornerback position. So what is Brian Kelly's philosophy moving forward? Now, it's not just the cornerback position, but what's the philosophy of recruiting moving forward? Brian Kelly mentioned kind of one of their philosophies, at least regionally. This was Brian Kelly.
We're going to identify the best prospects, throughout the country. And you'll see that in this signing class. We'll have players from the Northeast, from the Midwest, from the West Coast, but our base will be Louisiana and the South. But I don't think you can, when you're LSU and you have a brand that is so recognizable throughout the entire country, you can't have blinders on either, where you go, oh, I'm just in Louisiana and I'm not going outside it. So our scope and vision is national, but it's not like we're pulling, 4 guys out of every state. We're going to have a heavy influence in the state of Louisiana like we should, but we're going to know where the best players are in the country as well.
So there you go. That's kind of a broad scope of the recruiting philosophy moving forward. Not position specific, but more so specific of what the plan is for Brian Kelly in the recruiting group that they have assembled of, hey, we want to keep a hyper focus on the state of Louisiana, but we're also not going to have blinders onto the rest of the country. We want to keep really talented players home, and we want to keep other really talented players from the rest of the country. We want to bring them in, which I don't think is anything that's new. I think we all kind of understood that from the very first day that Brian Kelly came on LSU's campus. I feel like that was his message, was keep solid talent in the state of Louisiana home, and then bring in talent from surrounding states, Alabama and Texas and Florida and Georgia and, southern states that aren't too far from Louisiana. You want to bring those in as well. But also, hey, while our priority is the state of Louisiana, because I don't think it's any secret that Louisiana is one of the most football talent rich states in the country. And I'll even, focus that in on South Louisiana. You look at Baton Rouge and you look at New Orleans, some of the top players in the country come out of those cities, and they're right in LSU's backyard. So that should be the priority. And that being the priority isn't anything new, but they're saying, hey, we're not going to ignore the fact that there are some really, really good players, 4- and 5-star players that can come into LSU as well. I mean, and I think that you're seeing that philosophy come to fruition, because in the 2023 class, there's a ton of talent from in-state. I mean, LSU's highest-ranked recruit, Zaylen Hurd, a 5-star offensive tackle, he's from Louisiana. He's from Monroe. So that you've got a ton of talented players. Shelton Sampson, another one of the most highly recruited wide receivers in the country. He's from Baton Rouge. You keep those players home. But you also look at the 2023 class. Not only are there a lot of talented players from the state of Louisiana, you got players from Maryland and Texas and Florida and California and Minnesota and Georgia and Missouri and Nevada and Ohio. But you got players from all over the place. And whether those players from, all around the country do decide to stick with LSU and come to LSU, you still see the focus of LSU of looking at players from all over the country. So I think that's coming to fruition. I also don't think that's anything new. But it's nothing that you haven't heard before. And it makes sense, right? Like, keep your best players home, recruit some of the best players to come to LSU. Like, it's not rocket science. It's not anything that we haven't heard before. So that's the recruiting philosophy, at least from a regional standpoint, at least from a very macro standpoint of, hey, this is what we're looking at. This is what we want to prioritize. I knew that. I think you probably knew that too. And if you didn't, well then, there you go. You learn something new every day. But one thing that Brian Kelly mentioned that I didn't know was one of their recruiting philosophies, or at least one of their philosophies in 2023, or one of their priorities in 2023. And he mentions it in congruence with the cornerback position, but I think it goes beyond corner. I think it goes to the entire team as a whole and what they're looking at in 2023. So I did learn something new. This is what Brian Kelly had to say.
The way we feels best is you don't want to every year jump into the transfer portal when it comes to the cornerback position. We did it this year because there was such a need to put together a representative group. So I think there's going to be a heavy influence on freshmen. And that's how we want this program to be built. Does that mean we won't look at a transfer? No, it doesn't mean we would close the door on that. But last year, as you know, they were 1 year, and done. We're not looking in that respect. Corners would have to have, if we were to move in that direction, they would have to have more than one season of competition if we did go that route.
Okay, so I knew that Brian Kelly wanted to put an emphasis on Louisiana kids. But what I didn't know, what I just learned there, was their emphasis on developing young players. Was their emphasis on playing young players. The emphasis on playing freshmen, at least in the 2023 season. Now, Brian Kelly was asked, like we're on a first name basis. Brian Kelly was asked specifically about corners. And he mentions like, hey, this past year, we had to bring in corners to the transfer portal because we had no other option. And I get that. And now they're faced in a difficult position of you had to bring in players to the transfer portal last year, more specifically DBs through the transfer portal last year. So now you got to start all over this year because you brought in experienced and older players. So I understand the idea of we don't want to do that every year. But the new thing that I learned there was, I think in 2023, because while he was asked about corners, Brian Kelly said, this is how we want the program to be built. Not the cornerback position, not the DBs, not the defense. This is what we want. This is how we want the program to be built, with an emphasis on freshmen. So that's what I think that you can expect in 2023 and beyond, is when LSU lands these 4- and 5-star players, expect them to play. Expect them to contribute as freshmen. And I have some thoughts on that. I think that there are good things and there are bad things about that. So is this going to be a good thing for the program moving forward? Is this going to be a bad thing for the program moving forward? Or is it simply, this is just how the program is built? That's what I want to get into coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Bet Online, because betonline.net is your number one source for sports betting information, stats, news, and analysis. So get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college bowl season to basketball and the World Cup. Now that, Argentina has won it all yesterday, we've got it all on betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. So they are always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting information. That's why I love BetOnline.net, is because it's so easy to just pull it up on your phone and you get a few little tidbits and you feel a lot more confident to place your bet because you feel a little bit more informed. And so BetOnline.net is your one-stop shop. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. So Brian Kelly mentioned, when asked about the cornerback position, I think that he revealed to me, to us, to you, what the philosophy is going to be moving forward. And that is an emphasis on freshmen. They want to be a program that is built from the bottom up. It's built from freshmen that they bring in and develop, and they get experience. And then the next year, they're even better. And the next year, they're even better. So they can continue to compound this talent. It's almost like you are creating your own talent for the next year because you're developing it at the same time. So just think about this. LSU had, I made this argument. I had this take in the middle of the season, and I stand by it. I thought that LSU had the most impactful group of freshmen, at least in the SEC, because that's what I know more. You could even make the argument in all of college football as a whole, but I don't really know what the freshmen at San Diego State are doing. So I felt more qualified to make that argument that LSU had the most impactful group of freshmen in the SEC. I know that Quinshon Judkins won, SEC Newcomer of the Year, but that was one freshman at Ole Miss, a running back, that made a huge impact. Well, LSU had 3 of them. LSU had one of the top freshman players in the country, one of the top freshman defensive players in the country, one of the best defensive players in the country, and Harold Perkins. I mean, he single-handedly won you the Arkansas game. and made huge contributions throughout the rest of the season. I mean, he was giving who I think is the best quarterback in the country in Bryce Young. He was giving him problems all game long against Alabama. There you have Harold Perkins. Mason Taylor. I mean, he was the one that caught the game-winning 2-point conversion against Alabama. Mason Taylor was a consistent contributor all season long. Mason Taylor was used up in so many offensive schemes. Mason Taylor, a true freshman tight end. Will Campbell and John Emery. You're starting left and right tackle. Left tackle is the most difficult position to play on the offensive line. And LSU had a true freshman out there playing it. Oh, and let's not forget, the right tackle was also a true freshman as well. So if you think about how much talent LSU had in their true freshman class this year, think about how much better they're going to be next year. And think about some of the true freshmen that are coming in this year that can contribute, that can continue to kind of mimic that success that the freshman class had this year. So you're compounding talent, but you're developing yourself, and that come into your program and understand the philosophy and understand the expectations. And you're basically building a machine that just continues to pump out talent. And it's your talent. It's your talent and your players that you bring in that understand the expectations from day one. So I think that's one of the pros. That's one of the good things about having an emphasis on freshmen every year. Another one of the good things is you don't have to reload every year. You don't have to do what LSU was doing with the defensive back position this year of, okay, you recruit to the transfer portal, you bring guys in, you get them acclimated in the program, you get them bought into the program, they play that 1 year and then they leave. And then you start from square one the next year. And then you got to find other transfer portal players that have experience and you get them bought in and you develop them and then they leave. So it's almost exhausting that you have to start over every single year. Putting an emphasis on freshmen eliminates that. Putting an emphasis on freshmen says, okay, we are going to have a constant stash of corners. We're going to have a constant stash of offensive linemen, of running backs, you name it. We're going to have a constant stash of those. We don't have to constantly go out and recruit and through the transfer portal. I think the other thing too, that isn't necessarily an on the field thing, but if you can promise, these 4 and 5 star players that are getting offers from Ohio State and Clemson and Alabama and Georgia and Oregon, so on and so forth. If you can tell these 4 and 5 stars, hey, we really have placed an emphasis on getting playing time for our young guys, and you can see it. You can see it year in and year out that our freshmen are playing every game, every snap. Our freshmen are getting experience. That's really attractive for young and good players. Because I think that's kind of been the knock on Alabama, so to speak, that, hey, like you might be one of the top players in the country and you are going to get to play underneath one of the best, if not the best, college football coach in the history of the sport. But you're not going to see the field until your junior year. I think that's kind of been the knock and kind of the outside looking in perspective of Alabama recruiting. Whereas if you're Brian Kelly and you say, hey, you're not going to have to ride the bench for a couple of years. You might, but you also might not, because we want to give you some playing time. I think that's really attractive to high school players. And I think that can get you and maybe swing players from the Alabamas, the USCs, the Georgias, so on and so forth, because they want to see the field immediately. So that's another one of the pros, is you could probably swing 4 and 5 star players to come to your program when you can promise them, or at least, share your philosophy with them, that young players are the backbone and the foundation of this program. I think those are all good things. But I also hear Brian Kelly saying that they want this program to be built off of, freshmen. And that does concern me a little bit, especially now, because this coaching staff is so new. This philosophy is so new. And this team doesn't have a lot of depth. This team is losing a lot of its seniority. So, you're looking at 2023, and if you're emphasizing a lot of young players and true freshmen, you're not going to have a whole lot of experience on your team in 2023. You might have some growing pains. You might have some learning curves whenever you are starting this out, whenever you are starting from the ground up of, we want to give freshmen experience. And whenever a lot of your players who have been kind of backbones of the program, B.J. Ojulari, for example, you felt really confident about this team because you had players like Kayshon Boutte and B.J. Ojulari that were leaders on this program. And now you don't have the B.J. Ojularis of the team because they're going on and going to the next step. So I worry about that. Is this team going to take a step back in 2023 because some of these young players are still getting acclimated? These young players are getting experience, which is invaluable for the team moving forward. But is this team going to suffer at least in the short-term future because of it? Can these coaches get these young DBs? Can these coaches get these young wide receivers? These really talented players that are coming in the 2023 class, can these coaches get these players ready, prepped and ready to not just play, but also compete against some of the top teams in the country and compete for a spot in the SEC championship and in the college football playoff, which is very obviously been stated. That's Brian Kelly and his coaching staff's prerogative. That's their goal moving forward, as it should be. So that's one thing is I fear that this team could potentially take a step back. And I don't know, but maybe. I mean, it's not a crazy idea to think that a true freshman coming in and playing a big role might not be the most beneficial thing for this team right now. But it could be moving forward. Whereas when players experience their true freshman season, well, their sophomore and junior seasons, they're that much better. So it's almost like you have to take 2 steps back in order to take 5 steps forward. So that's one thing to look into is, how is this team going to fare with players who have never had college football experience? And it's not like they have any, time to get prepped and ready because it's like, oh, week 1, you're playing Florida State. Good luck. And I think the second thing is whenever you emphasize true freshmen, you emphasize bringing in your own recruits rather than the transfer portal, I fear about depth for the future because there is nothing that's stopping those players, those freshmen that are coming in, those players that you want to develop. There's nothing stopping them from entering the transfer portal. And that could potentially come back and bite you in the butt because you don't have a ton of depth there, at least in the short term. Because once this gets moving, once you are like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years into this philosophy, into what Brian Kelly wants to bring into this team, then you've built some depth. But at least in the short term, there's nothing stopping them from leaving. And that might leave you with a little bit vulnerable and forced to build through the transfer portal. And that sets off this plan and this philosophy for a few years. But also in that same breath, if these young kids are getting playing time and they are buying into what this team is doing, what this coaching staff is doing, then they won't even want to enter the transfer portal. But I mean, I think we've been surprised by a lot of the transfer portal entries, not even at LSU, but, just in college football in general. I look at Drew Pine, for example, quarterback at Notre Dame. He entered the transfer portal, and I'm like, well, why? Like he got a lot of playing time. He played really well. What does he want to leave at Notre Dame? So I think you'll be surprised by some of these players, not necessarily at LSU, but they'll enter the transfer portal, and you're like, I don't really get it. So that's another thing that I keep in mind. But I think overall, it's a really interesting philosophy, and I think it's a good way to build up your team for the future. Because I look at Georgia, for example. Georgia is a team that looks like it's equipped to become the new dynasty of college football. It looks like, to where it stands right now, I think that Georgia's going to go back-to-back. Georgia didn't build, and Kirby Smart didn't build this potential dynasty in a day, didn't build it in a year. They built that up over the rest of, or the past of Kirby Smart's career and his first 3, 4, 5 years at Georgia. And now it's paying off. Now it's paying dividends. So I like the idea for the future. It just might take a little bit of patience in 2023. But thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen today. Now make your second listen today, Locked on Sports Today. Peter Bukowski brings you the biggest stories from around the sports world in about 20 minutes. Get the analysis and opinions before anyone else with our local and national experts and insiders. Locked on Sports Today podcast is available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.